to you can be seated today. So thankful to see you all here. Amen. I kind of accidentally re-stumbled into a study I know that we've done in the past, but I've heard it mentioned a time or two here lately, and then I actually was just trying to take a look at the time of year that we're in, and it just so happened that this particular book of the Bible addresses some things that happened or were happening around this time of year. And so I thought we would take a look at this for the next couple of weeks maybe. My plan is we're gonna take a look again at the book of Esther. And I say the book of Esther, I think more so the story of Esther. We'll take a look at it for a couple of weeks. And then I've also had several people comment to me about wanting there to be some financial teachings, teaching on finances, budget, what the Bible talks about. We'll take a look. We'll get through Esther, and then we'll do a couple of weeks where we look at finances. And I think as just far as planning goes on that, I think probably our first week of our financial talk, maybe the first or second week, depending on how that goes, we'll allow it to live stream. But I think when we sit down and we just go over kind of budgets, numbers, any of that kind of stuff, I think some of that in the weeds kind of things, I doubt that we will stream that online. But I think as long as we're talking biblical principle, we'll let that be a thing that goes out. But when it comes down to trying to talk numbers and some of that, that won't be up. So that just kind of looking out, probably get us through March would be my guess with that. So just as you're thinking ahead, and I'll try to mention, especially the financial class, I'll try to mention that again on Sunday, just because I know I've had more than just a couple comment about wanting something like that. So to take a look at Esther, like I say, I know that we've done Esther. In fact, I don't remember when we did Esther last. But as I look out, I think there's enough new faces that it won't hurt to do it again. So as far as the book of Esther, as far as the story of Esther is concerned, just for what it's worth, point of information that when you read the account of Esther, the events of Esther, they fall within as time phrase wise, they fall within the book of Ezra. And so in Ezra, between chapters 6 and chapter 7 is where the events of Esther take place. So as far as just in your Bible reading, if you read through Ezra, you could stop after chapter 6, jump over and read Esther, or know that happened, and then go back and read 7 and pick up, and it would fit in line with the things that are going on there. And like I mentioned on Sunday, when we look at different books of the Bible, when we crack the book open and we start to read things, what we're going to see is there's a lot of different characters that come into play within the book of Esther. And I think we would do well to lay ourselves and our thinking over against all of them. To not just want to, I mean, obviously Esther herself is she's a heroine. She is, she's the hero of the story. And it's the temptation of ours to want to identify with the heroes. But unfortunately, we don't always identify with the heroes. In fact, it's one of the things that pains me the most is how much I feel like sometimes I can identify with Saul in the Old Testament. He was a bad guy. at least in relation to David, but yet I feel like I understand his thinking. I can see so much of what he's done, and so I hate that I can relate to him, but as we work through this story, I think what we see highlighted in each individual are some unique character traits, and I think human traits, some for better, some for worse, and the reality is that we are all a grouping of all different kinds of human emotions and traits, and so we should be able to see ourselves in most of these characters that we take a look at. One of the things that stands out as a curiosity or as an interesting point with the book of Esther is in the entirety of the book, there is no mention of God. In fact, it's even a little bit surprising. There is no mention of prayer or of God in the entirety of the book. And I know that when we approach Scripture, especially when we approach stories like this, there can be an easy tendency to want to read in goodness and godliness and to want to read God and prayer and maybe some of those traits into some of the characters when it may not have been the case that God may not have been first and foremost on the minds of some of the people in this book. And we'll talk about it as we get into some aspects of the story when we look at Mordecai and some of his things. And so it's a curious thing that there is no direct mention of God. And along the same lines, there are no notable miracles found within the story of Esther. No fire from heaven, no divine things, no unnatural things that could only be attributed to God, right? Which again, it stands in contrast to a lot of the other stories. I mean, you've got from some places where the prophet causes an axe head to float, a random miraculous intervention thing. And you've got other places where prayers are made and where people wrestle with God and all of these kinds of things. But this seems to be absent in these stories. Now, it's not to say that God's not in it. In fact, there are those who argue that some of the writings and the reason why it kind of goes the way that it goes is to sort of speak to this idea that even though you can't always see God clearly and the things that are happening or transpiring doesn't mean that God's not involved in it, right? And so I think even as we consider the historical setting and timing of all of this, even in our own lives, in times when maybe we find ourselves drifting from God, or we may find ourselves wrestling with what we feel like God maybe hasn't done for us, and we can feel a kind of disconnect from God. That just because we may find ourselves thinking in those ways where we might feel distanced from God doesn't mean that He is not being active. And it also speaks, some say, to in fact, it is one of the things that I think some of the Jewish scholars highlight and that they recognize is, or maybe celebrate, is that they see a greater testimony of the power and the workings of God for there not to be any miracles. Because a miracle suggests that God had to break the rules in order to fix something that was broken or to do something outside of what would be natural. But the fact that God is able to work within the laws that He established suggests a greater mind, a greater aspect of God than one who says, oh man, things got out of hand, I got to do something major to fix this, right? And so there is an element to them where they celebrate the lack of miracles over the abundance of miracles. And so this is one of the things that we see. Everything that plays out in this would not necessarily require God's hand, but yet there is this sort of undercurrent of assumption that that God is at work in it. And the book as a whole, it is a book of crisis. It's a book of crisis. There's problems that are going on. This is not people that have everything going well for them. I mean, it would be easy to say, oh yeah, this is a great story of a young lady who was plucked out of obscurity and placed into the royal house. This is, rags to riches kind of story, but it truly, from beginning to end, it's a story of crisis after crisis after crisis. And in fact, even the extreme nature of the crisis that we're going to see in the book of Esther, it's possible that the greatest problem that needs solved in the book of Esther was actually of the main character or the main family's own making. Which again, I don't know about you, but I can relate to the times in which I've had to invite God in to help me fix the problems that I've created. I wish that every problem that I prayed for was just because somebody else was an idiot. But sometimes it's me, right? Sometimes I'm the one that the Lord is like, And so I think we have that, because I think Mordecai, we're going to see, just might have been the one who sparked the biggest conflict and controversy that is then the problem that they're trying to solve. And so before we even get into this story, I think, again, in times when it feels like maybe God hasn't spoken, and I don't know if you've ever gone through a season of life where it feels like God's silent, and it feels like you are in a mess of your own making, and it feels like even the things that you are doing religiously or that would be tied to God might just be more out of habit or routine than they are out of true conviction. If you've ever found yourself in any of those kinds of places, then Esther is the book for you. Because that's where they live, and they live there for quite a while. In fact, the book of Esther covers approximately 12 years, all from beginning to end. But as we start into this, and I won't read, if you guys will allow me, if you'll trust me to just sort of retell the story and pause as we get through it, I would encourage you to read it over the next couple of weeks. I think it reads as a story, so it's not like reading through Numbers or Leviticus type of deal where it's names. It's pronounceable names and a followable storyline. Okay, so it's a good one to drop into. And so as it opens up, though, we are introduced to the king of Babylon. Xerxes is his name, and he is or Syrian. He is the Syrian king of Persia, and he is we're at just about the peak of their reign and their control, the area of their control. And it opens then with Xerxes being so proud of his accomplishments and what he is doing that he throws a 6-month party in honor of himself and his accomplishments. And this party that goes on, in fact, he tells his servants, just keep the wine flowing. Whatever, if anybody asks for it, you give it to them. We're not shutting anybody off. There's not going to be any last call. There's not going to be any of that kind of stuff. You just let the wine flow. There is a little bit of irony as we get into this story that this party starts out with a man who celebrates his own accomplishments and then ironically concludes with a display of the lack of his ability to rule over his own life, over his own spirit. Proverbs 25 and 28 says, "He that has no rule over his own spirit is like a city that's broken down and without walls." And so as the story goes, they're in the middle of this party. They're in the middle of this time. He's got a party. His wife, the queen, she's actually having a party and celebrating with the ladies in another section of the palace. And one day when he's feeling particularly whatever, he calls for the queen. He says, I want you to get all decked out in your royal garb, and I want you to come over here, and I want to parade you in front of all of our rulers. I want them to see just how beautiful you are. And again, to the extreme or to the extent of which he wanted her to display herself is not clear. But what we know is that the Queen Vashti, says no. And of course, those of you that are or have been married, know that the best time to have a disagreement with your spouse is in public. For that is where the best of you comes out, and you're not embarrassed at all. Well, she denies, and it's unsure if it was just one request or several, but either way, she probably denied him several times, and he becomes enraged. He gets so mad because she won't listen that he calls a meeting with all of his counselors and the wise men. He had a place where the king would go and take counsel. Today, we would call it probably the golf course. A place to where we go and get advice, right? But he gathers people around and he says, I need help figuring out what my response needs to be to my wife. What do I do with the queen? In fact, his question is, are there any laws that directly speak against the queen? That directly address this issue that she's done. And so the reasoning of these men comes to not exactly, however, she's the queen. And everybody, it's not, in fact, before we even end this conversation, I am sure the news of what she has done has already spread to the farthest parts of your kingdom. And if you don't do something about it, then all of the men are going to have problems with their wives. If the queen can get mouthy with her husband, then they're all going to get mouthy with their husbands. So you better crack the whip. See how you can relate? You can find yourself relating to different people in the story. Isn't that crazy? We're not even hardly six verses in. But the council suggests that her rebellion was likely to be repeated by every woman throughout the kingdom. And so for the sake of everyone, you've got to make an example of the queen. And so I will pause right here to highlight a true statement in this. Okay? A true statement is that those that are in leadership must be mindful of what they do. And leadership, again, leadership applies to parents. It applies to those of influence within their families. It applies to those that find themselves maybe even in positions of leadership within their work. But anybody who finds themselves in a place of leadership or in a place of influence should be mindful of what they do, because what they example is often going to be repeated, often in greater extent by those who choose to follow that leadership. And so it is something that I think we need to be aware of. I think really everybody should be concerned about their example. It should be concerned about what they are communicating and the way that they are living their life, and understanding they have influence on others. However, it is something that needs to be a part of us. Now, there is a danger in taking that to the extreme, in which you only consider your actions in relation to doing what's best for those who follow me. right? So it's not always just about self-denial to the promotion of others, but there does need to be a balance and awareness of my influence and my effect on others, as seemingly small as you might think that it is. And so there is some truth in the caution of what they're saying of, listen, stuff that happens in the palace is going to filter through into the lives of others. Lesson number 2 is in this particular story with the king, but the husband, but really anyone who demands respect without behaving in a manner consistent with deserving it is deceiving themselves. That you really can only go so far standing on or beating people with a title. If you truly want to have leadership, if you truly want to be effective and influential, don't demand respect. Live in such a way that it invites it from others. Because if you have to lean on law or rules or force in order to be treated with honor, it might be time to look inward and figure out why you have to force people to like you. And so I think it should encourage us to conduct ourselves in such a way that respect is earned. I think the appropriate behavior of this king in this moment, it should have been, instead of to flaunt or to make a spectacle of his spouse, he should have sought to preserve her modesty and respect for her, rather than trying to use her in order to advance his own agenda or to boost his own whatever. He should have instead honored and celebrated her in a different way. It's something that's important, the way that you treat others. Right? Not everybody, in fact, people should not be leveraged to your own benefits all the time. It ought to be something that you treat others with respect as well. So in all of this, he allows his ear to be bent towards that decision. And so in his rage, he divorces her and he has her banished from his presence. He kicks her out. Which reminds me actually of a story, and I forget where it's at. It's chapter 2. It says, after his anger subsided, he started to think about it. That's the wrong order, right? You don't get angry and act and then think. No, you need to put your thinking in front of your actions. But it reminds me of a statement, I forget the guy's name, Brother Rex Johnson, I think it was. One of the things that he stated when I was in Bible college, he said, I've never regretted anything that I didn't say in anger. Right? And so there's power in controlling yourself and ruling your own spirit. And so as he begins to be reflective and possibly regretful over the severity of his actions, they have to step in and convince him, don't undo what you've done. Don't back down now. Keep on going. You can't appear weak. You can't, which for what it's worth, it's not weakness to change your mind. It's not weakness to identify and recognize that you made a wrong decision or that you made a bad mistake, or to take ownership of those kinds. Is not a sign of weakness. It's actually a sign of strength, right? And so either way, they convince him not to do it, and they said, here, let's do this. She's out of the picture, but let's do this. Let's gather a bunch of young ladies. We'll bring in a bunch of virgins, and we will let you choose from the best of the land a new replacement. And so that had its effect on getting him to stay the course. And so that's what they do. They send word out, and they gather from everywhere the most beautiful young ladies in the country, in the realm. They bring them to the palace, and they begin to go through. Each one of them goes through a beautification process, which is unlike any that I have ever heard of in my life. For 12 months, they are pampered. 6 months of spice-infused oil treatments. This is, oh man, don't mistake what I'm about to say. What is this? What's the fancy beef from China that they do? Wagyu, right? When that stuff started off, these cows were supposed to have been pampered, and they're massaged, and they're catered to, and what? This was like the first Wagyu. 6 months of spiced infused oil, 6 months of fragrance treatments. After a year of pampering, which I'll just throw this out. If you find a coupon, if there is a massage place in town that has this, I wouldn't be opposed to trying it. But for a year, they go through all of this treatment before they are ready. And then they get one night with the king. And so they're moved from the preparation side of the house, a night with the king, and then they're moved officially into his harem. And ultimately, then, whomever he would choose would be the one that would become the queen. And so that was the process. That was the story. That's the thing that then transpires. And so in chapter 2, then, we are introduced to a family. And we are introduced to a fellow by the name of Mordecai and his adopted cousin of Esther. And Esther was younger than Mordecai. Now keep in mind, we are in a foreign nation. We are not in Israel at this time. We're not in Jerusalem. We are dealing with Jews that have been taken into captivity, and in fact, they have been in captivity. It's likely that Esther was born in captivity. All she knew was life under this king. Mordecai, it depends on how old he was. He could have had knowledge of the formal life, but either way, both of them were born in a place of captivity, and knowing that where it falls in the story of Ezra, the beginning part of Ezra saw Jews returning to Jerusalem, returning and starting to build. They had put together the tabernacle. They'd put the temple back together and were starting to offer sacrifices and things that were going on. And it is of note, just to let it linger in your head, that when the call was made for people to come back and help to rebuild, Mordecai didn't go. Right? So when the option was, we're going to go back to our homeland and we're going to go start stuff back up, Mordecai wasn't one of the ones who wanted to go back. Now, whether that is just, again, sometimes you're stuck and you can't go. Sometimes situation doesn't allow for that kind of movement. Sometimes there might just be maybe there's a bitterness in your heart over the fact that you were born here and not there. Right? Maybe there was something. He finds himself positioned outside of the palace. He finds himself out here where he's in a place of kind of influence as he sits in the gate, which was a place of conversation. It was a place of deciding factors. So maybe there was a little bit of, hey, I've got something good right here, and I don't want to leave this to go back to that. But either way, he has chosen to stay in a place that is not near the temple. It's not near what God is doing with Ezra and eventually Nehemiah. And so again, I think that may be of note. But either way, we're introduced to this family. And so Esther, though, is a beautiful young lady, and she is brought in and made a part of the king's harem. She goes through all of this treatment. And it lets us know in chapter 2, verse 17, that the king loved Esther more than any of the other young women, so much so that he places the crown on her head. Now, this is one of those moments when you're reading through chapter 2. You see how she's brought in when Esther comes in. Before she comes in, Mordecai, her uncle, her adopted father, or whatever, one who took care of her, he tells her, he says, don't let anybody know that you are from Israel. Don't let anybody know that you are a Jew. Now, again, I don't know if, again, it would be easy to say that he understood the reputation of being a conquered people, right? That they were a people that had been overthrown a few decades earlier, and so there was this idea of don't let them know that that is who you are, when the reality is, for this empire to be as big as it was, there were a lot of conquered people. So much so that later on, when the decrees start to go out from the palace, it says it goes out to a lot of different people and in a lot of different languages. Right? So it may not have been out of just a negative opinion of others of who they were. There could have been a little bit of him saying, we're disconnecting. We're trying to disconnect from that, right? Again, we don't want to believe that. That's not what we want to say. It's not there, but I'm just trying to write in our heads that the decisions that he's making, it's not necessarily that this was an isolated, oppressed group of people. Again, you find this guy who, of his own merit, before too long, in fact, the king even eventually calls him, Mordecai the Jew, and still is able to promote him. Right? And so there's something that's going on. And so again, this could be one of those moments that for whatever reason, the Lord impressed on Mordecai. But either way, he says, listen, when you get in there, don't tell anybody what your ancestry is. Don't let anybody know where you've come from. And so she honors her leader. She honors her, I don't know if you want to call it adopted dad or stepdad, whatever you want to call that, but she honors him. And so she keeps her nationality hidden. And so as we look at some of this stuff, we can assume, or I think we do, we assume that Esther's obedience and her conduct was in pursuit of gaining favor with God. We can assume that she was trying to be godly, although it's never stated as much. Again, we want to read that into the story sometimes. But if that's the case, if there was something in her that said this is what it means to be a child of God, is to honor my parents. I'm going to honor Mordecai, my fill-in parent. I'm going to be obedient to him. It also lets us know that once she got into the harem and starts getting treated with all of the oils and the stuff, that the people that were appointed to tend to her and care for her liked her. They liked her more than some of the other gals. And so that matters. She, in her desire to gain favor, if we assume that was in her desire to gain favor with God, she also gained favor with men. And we know that she was humble in all that she did, in her obedience and her likability. And even when it was time for her to go in to be with the king, she only took what was recommended. She didn't try to cover herself with too much, but she went with a kind of humility in her. And even after she was appointed and made the queen, she still submitted to the authority of her adopted parent and kept her nationality hidden. Right? And there's something to be said when you're the queen. Not just think you're the queen, but when you are the queen, to still be submitted to somebody else's authority that speaks to the character of a person. And it's important for us to always have someone who is allowed to speak into our lives. Right? It's important that we always, that regardless of power, regardless of position, regardless of authority with others, we have got to give somebody else, we need someone in our life that has permission to offer us direction and advice. Not with blind obedience, but willingly considering and following their guidance and their advice. It's so important. And so once again, so we have this story. So she gets appointed as queen. Then we get sort of this break in the story. So we have a deposed queen, we have a mad king, a deposed queen, and we have a new queen. Esther's getting set on the throne. And so while she's there, we have Mordecai, who's on the outside, and through the whole process, he's checking in with her, seeing how things are going. And then as he has advanced to his place of sitting in the gates, he overhears a couple of the eunuchs inside, and a couple of those that were helping tend to the king. He hears them talking of a plan to kill the king. And so he sends word to Esther, and he says, hey, listen, these guys are out here conspiring. They're trying to kill the king. I think you need to let the king know. And so she tells the king, she says, listen, Mordecai has brought this information. The plot is foiled. The king is saved, and there is record that's written down in the book of the Kings. So as the story progresses, again, we just get this sort of glimpse, this moment where Mordecai saves the king. And as we're doing this, what we're seeing is it's more than just story for the sake of story, but we're seeing this kind of positioning. Again, if we're going to talk about the sovereignty of God, if we're going to talk about the providence of God, God's ability to be able to see and to direct, he's positioning pieces right now. Right? He has removed Vashti, he has placed Esther, and now he has allowed, because of favor and whatever, maybe the skill of Mordecai, he has positioned Mordecai to be able to hear the plot, right? He's got these kinds of things that, yes, could have just happened all coincidentally. But again, we're understanding a God who can work through the normal and not just... he can work through the natural and not just, right, the supernatural. He doesn't have to break the rules. He can work within the rules. And so it takes some time then for us to get all these details of how God has positioned everyone, and then to know that God has positioned all of them, put them in a place before there was a need for them to be where they were. Right? God, there's not this... let's wait until a problem arises and then let's bring the solutions into the picture. God places the solutions before the need arose. Why? Now, again, it's one thing to just say that. It's one thing to read it and see it in the story as we read through this and be like, oh yeah, I can see that. But then if we're going to take this and say, okay, here's a story, if this is a truth that we have about God, if this is something we are able to glean about God regarding a people that may or may not have been as invested in that God as I would say most of us are to be here on a Wednesday night. God able to position them. What does that mean for us? It means it could be, possibly is, that God is and has positioned things in your life before you've even needed it. It may be that God's positioning you. I mean, let's just ponder for a moment. I don't know. I can't speak. Nobody has ever tried to do this with me, but I don't know what it would be like to be taken away from my family and my friends and to basically be held hostage, granted in a palace. But whatever plans Esther had, they're gone. Whatever hope for a normal life that she had was gone. It didn't tell us if there was a boy across the street that she liked, but it doesn't matter. Right? And it would be easy to say, oh man, queen, that's got to be good. That's got to be great. Well, we're about to find out here in a little bit that on more than one occasion she feared for her life. I mean, if you take a look at the treatment of the queen before her, nothing's guaranteed, nothing is forever. And so even to look at her life, yeah, there were some benefits and yeah, there were some perks. But it may not have been worth, like if it was her choice, she may have weighed and said, I don't think so. I think I would choose this. I would choose being able to grow my own food and have my own family and live on the outskirts of town and love the man that I love and not have to be bound to. Right? And so it's possible that there were times where she mourned her reality. But yet God had positioned her in a place. And he was going to leverage her even in, and again, we can look sometimes at our reality. We can look at the things going on in our life and say, man, if I could choose to be somewhere else, if I could choose to go through something else, I would probably choose something else. And it's all right to have those thoughts. It's all right to think like that, but we also have to keep in the back of our mind that it might just be that God's positioned you. It might just be that God has brought into your life and into your situation you to the greater effect of others. And the people that he has brought alongside you to be an influence in your life. Granted, it's not always easy to let the possibilities of the future outweigh the realities of the present. That's not always an easy thing to do. But I think it needs to be a factor that kind of lingers in our mind sometimes. And so we have this positioning. Again, Esther. She was an orphan. She had to be adopted by a cousin. Then she's taken into a palace. At no point, I don't think at any point would she have chosen any of those steps for herself. But yet nevertheless, she finds herself where she is. Think even those of you that are here. Think of the times when somebody's walked through the doors of this church and you've greeted them. And God positioned you to meet them at that moment. God saved you at a time in the past so that you could make a connection with them today. So we need to not underestimate our value to the kingdom, right? And to at least give ourselves the words that says, just because I can't see it yet. Because actually the truth is you may never see it. Some of the promises God gave, in fact, a lot of the promises God gave Abraham, he never saw. Read through Hebrews, right? Hebrews 11, and the faith. There were a lot of them that received promises of God and walked in the faith, but never saw the result of their promises. But just because you don't see it doesn't mean that it's not working. But we keep on doing right for the kingdom. And we keep on doing right for the kingdom, not for the reward today. Because we're going to see one of the things that comes up here is you have Mordecai who he does this thing where he reveals this plot to save the king and he gets no reward. No thank you. In a kingdom that is riddled with banquets. I mean, they had any chance to have a party, they had a chance to have a party. There was a 6-month party to start it off. Then they had a party when Esther became queen. Esther throws a party for the king twice. I mean, they were looking for excuses to have parties. This dude saves the king's life. He didn't even get a thank you card. And it would be easy. Again, it would be easy to say, hey, I hate it. Because don't we hate rewards deferred? I hate it when I don't get recognized for doing something good. It seems like all everybody ever sees is when I do something bad. How about a pat on the back when I finally get it right? But reward deferred. Things that we're doing for the kingdom of God's not for rewards today anyways. I mean, the very nature of heaven is reward deferred. And it just might be that reward deferred is part of God's positioning for what he's going to do later in your life. Because that was actually the case for Mordecai. So as all of this is going on, you have Esther being elevated to being queen. You've got Mordecai uncovering this plot, and he's positioned within the, somewhat of the leaders of the palace. And then we are introduced to a fellow by the name of Haman. And it says that in all of this, while all of this is going on, a fellow by the name of Haman is promoted to being second command in the kingdom. And Haman is given one of the rings from the king, and he has a lot of authority. He's got a lot of sway. He's got a lot of pride. Power goes to his head, and he demands. Where have we seen that before? He demands honor and respect. Borderline worship. In fact, the expectation was that when he walked into or through a room, everybody would bow down to him. Dude had a ego problem. A big ego problem. But Mordecai refused to bow down to Haman. Once again, we can assume, in fact we often do, that Mordecai's refusal to bow to Haman was out of religious conviction. Right? We want to read into Mordecai the same conviction that was in Daniel and the 3 Hebrew boys who refused to bow down to the idol of the king. Refused to bow down when the music was working. We want to read that into Mordecai when it may not have been there. Because we see where Mordecai appears to have respect for the king. He appears to have communicated that even to Esther, that they're going to respect and they're going to honor the king. He just has a problem with Haman. And so, it's possible. Again, it doesn't say one way or another. The story reads different if you want to hand to Mordecai this spiritual conviction that caused him to refuse to bow down to another. The story reads differently. It's not there specifically, but what could also be read into this is that Mordecai just didn't like Haman. That he saw that arrogance and he saw that ego. And he was like, forget that. And he was just stubborn. It could have been that Mordecai was just a jerk. He knew that it bothered that guy, and so he was doing it just because he knew that it bothered him. Now again, maybe I'm reading too much of Ben Smith into Mordecai, okay? Maybe that is the case. But if you want to read that into the story, it doesn't hurt the story. It doesn't detract from the story. It doesn't cause God to say, well, that's too corrupt and that's not good enough for me to use. That's not good enough for me to love. That's not, no, because of you, I'm going to allow the whole plan to fall apart, which is sometimes how we can talk about our story And we can feel like sometimes God writes us off, or God brings travesty or tragedy because I made bad decisions, or because I had a bad attitude, or because I thought in a wrong way, when that may not be the case. God's going to do what God's going to do, and He'll position whoever and wherever He needs to do it. God, this again, I'm not saying this. I'm not trying to give us permission to be idiots and jerks. It's not what I'm saying. But me being an idiot is not going to be the speed bump in the road for the Lord. And so, regardless of the motive of Mordecai, he refuses to bow down and honor Haman. A lot of people talk about it. In fact, they'll even come over and they're like, dude, what's wrong with you? Why are you picking at him? Why are you doing this? We don't really get an answer. He just won't do it. And what should have been just a little matter, of all of the people, I mean, when you think about this, I think Esther, in her preparation, and I don't know how many total women, how many total virgins they brought in for this process, but I think Esther alone had over half a dozen servants that were dedicated just to her. So there had to be a massive amount of servants and people within the palace and their operations. And out of all of them, one guy got under the skin of Haman. And that became his fixation. All he could see was Mordecai. And it ate at him. And it consumed him. So much so that Haman said, I hate that guy. Cannot stand him. It is amazing, folks, how little things have a way of eating at you and becoming bigger than what they should be in our life. And you know how to make little things into big things? Let that be the only thing that you focus on. And you don't think little things have a big impact? Why don't you go and find a little rock and put it in your shoe and walk around all day with it, and then tell me little things don't have a nagging effect on your life. It's possible, folks, and it does. And this was the case. Something that should have been insignificant, something that should have been little, it consumed Haman. And it created such a hatred inside of him that finally, when it came time for him to act, it wasn't enough that they simply kill Mordecai. It wasn't enough, because I think at this point they talked to him, and this moment, it finally builds to this moment, and they're like, just kill him. I mean, if he bugs you that much, just kill him. Make him an example for everybody. The king did it to the two people that tried to kill him. They took a spear and impaled him on a spear. He said, just do that with Mordecai. In fact, build it, make it tall. Depending on the translation and the measurements, upwards to 75 feet tall. Feels excessive. 7 would have worked. 75's a little bit. But either way, just do that. But Haman says it's not enough just to kill him. I need it to be bigger. Listen, revenge, the need for revenge, it kills both ways. It wasn't enough for him. And so they start to plot, and here's what we're going to do. And they put this plan together, and they're like, it's not enough that we just kill Mordecai, the Jew. We're going to go after all of his nationality. And so the plan was, what we're going to do is we're going to write a law. The plan, we're going to work it so that there is a law that makes it so that anybody who is a non-Jew on a particular day of the year gets to kill a Jew and then take whatever their possessions are. Man, woman, child, doesn't matter, just kill them. That was the plan. And so they cast lots, rolled dice, whatever it was, to figure out what day of the year that was going to be. And I think, I say it later on, I think March 7th. March 7th was the date that was selected. Now, thankfully, the casting of lots was like the end of March. What did I say? May? March. It was March 7th. The end of March, they cast lots. And so March 7th of the next year, so almost a year later, is when it was planned. And just for what it's worth, when we think of all of this, the word for casting lots was Purim. And so the Feast of Purim, the Festival of Purim, coming up here, March 7th and 8th, is the celebration of this event, of this moment. And so this becomes the plan then that's hatched by Haman to say, we're not just going to kill Mordecai, we're going to kill all of the Jews. So with that, though, let's stand. I'm already over time, okay? So quickly, as to get through the end of chapter 3, which is where we're at, Haman then, he says, I'm going to he approaches the king with some creative storytelling. In fact, he elevates himself to be a little bit on par with the king, assuming or claiming that what offended Haman would also offend the king. He says, listen, there's some people in your kingdom that aren't listening to you. When really what he was saying, there's some people in your kingdom that aren't listening to me, but I'm going to give you my offense. Haman promised 10,000 bags of silver for permission to go after these people. And he doesn't identify them. He doesn't identify the nationality. He says there's just some people out there. Being vague. I couldn't imagine hating somebody so much that I'd be willing to give up that kind of money. But either way, he's granted permission to be able to do that, and that's when the decree, March 7th, is when it's going to happen. And so we've introduced at this point, we've introduced all of the characters. We've got the king, we have Haman, we have Esther, we have Mordecai. And all of these players, now everything's starting to converge because now we have our crisis. Now the crisis is here. The hatred is not just because of their nationality. The hatred of the people was because of the actions of one man. That's why I say it's possible that this crisis was solely Mordecai's doing. That just because he was a jerk, he creates a problem. If we need Mordecai to be spiritual, then it was because he was spiritual that they hated him and created this problem. But either way, the crisis has been introduced. But notice, before the crisis comes, the pieces have been put into place. And then we're going to pick up chapter 4. Chapter 4 the next time we come together with this. And we're going to take a look and see how God works and how things play out to the favor of God's people. Because up to this point, nobody has asked God for direction. Nobody has asked God for clarity. And God hasn't said anything. We've just got people moving in pride, with the exception of our heroine, our humble Esther. And so, Lord, we love you and we are thankful, God, for this story. I'm thankful, God, that you wrote down the good and the bad of the things that happened, the things that moved us right and the things that moved us wrong. And I'm thankful even for some of the vagueness that's here, because it allows us to be able to read maybe some of ourselves into this in a way that can convict us and in a way that can speak hope and promise into our own lives. And so I thank you, God, for this word. I thank you for your working in our own lives, God, and maybe in ways that we can't see, Lord, and to give ourselves and to give you the leeway in our life to recognize, God, that maybe, just maybe, you're doing things and working in ways that we can't see, and to trust you and to trust the process, and that we would keep ourselves seeking after you and desiring your glory in all of it. I love you, Lord, and I thank you for these things tonight, and we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Well, God bless you. You're dismissed in the fear of God. Greet one another and be friendly.